This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where's the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 88 of the Naked Mormonism podcast. This is the Serial Mormon History podcast. Today is February 1st, 2018. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. On this episode, we pick up with giving Wilford Woodruff his very own NaMo nickname. After that, we jump into the historical timeline following the Quorum of the 12 Apostles on their journey from Liverpool to New York aboard the ship Rochester and the great tempests and near death they faced. Then we zoom back into Nauvoo to see what Joe and friends were up to while the Quorum was on their way home. Tom Ass Sharp fires some shots across the bow of the Mormons Times and Seasons, and the Mormons fire back. After that, we're joined by a children's book author who offers some insight to his method of teaching children a love for science and skepticism. Let's get into it. What value can be placed upon the ineffable feeling of permanence? The idea of humans having 5 senses has been resoundingly debunked ages ago in lieu of modern psychology putting the number above 20 senses. You know, there's sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. Those are the big 5, but there are more than a dozen other senses our human body picks up and feeds into our brain. Proprioception, where we are in space. The sense of pressure, and that's kind of related to touch, but the sense of tension in our own muscles. Nociception, that's our sense of pain. Chemoreceptors, that's how our brain knows about chemical and hormonal changes in our bloodstream. Hunger, thirst, time, all of these are senses that don't fall into the big 5 senses. What about our sense of well-being? Where we fall on the gradient from safe well-being to complete anxiety is a much harder sense to quantify. One of the subjective senses wrapped up in our sense of well-being is a sense of permanence. Humans can't successfully achieve homeostasis without feeling like they have something or somewhere they can call home. Even nomadic tribes who follow the hunt have temporary places that they call home to fulfill the overwhelming sense of needing permanence. So I ask, again, what value can be placed on a feeling of permanence? April 20th, 1841, most of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles were currently anchored just outside Liverpool, awaiting their passage to America. They left behind Parley P. Pratt, that's P cubed, and Orson Hyde, to run the Millennial Star periodical and continue his mission to the Holy Land, respectively. On board the ship Rochester, Bloody Brigham Young and Heber Creeper Kimball were the directing agents of over 100 converts who were just beginning their immigration to join the Saints in Nauvoo. This was not the first group of European immigrants to make their way to America because of Mormonism, but this small group was tantamount to Bloody Brigham presenting Joe with a few pelts to prove that he had done what he had set out to do. It'd be another 2.5 months before Brigham and the rest of the Quorum made their way back to Nauvoo, where they received a much-deserved glowing reception from the prophet. Before discussing their transoceanic voyage of the 12 and the accompanying 130 immigrants, we have some business to take care of. Wilford Woodruff. Woodruff would eventually become the prophet who outlawed polygamy in the Utah years, and he's been a member of our timeline for quite some time without becoming terribly distinguished. As the Nauvoo years progress, Wilford Woodruff will become increasingly more important to us, and he's deserving of his very own NaMo nickname. As per the rules of our NaMo nickname, I propose a few terrible possible names, and then you guys vote on Twitter or Facebook at Naked Mormonism, and then I arbitrarily pick a winner from the entries. Last week's winner came in the Twitter under the name of Taken Hayek Seriously, that is at Friedrich Hayek, who proposed Willie Goat Woodruff, followed up by Look at the Beard. It's perfect. I couldn't help but chuckle. So that is definitely our winner for Wilford Woodruff's NaMo nickname for this week. So Willie Goat Woodruff. That is how we will know Wilford Woodruff in our NaMo historical timeline as we progress further into the Nauvoo and Utah years. So be sure to give at Friedrich Hayek a follow. That is at Friedrich Hayek, Friedrich Hayek. So this week's NaMo nickname proposal comes for another increasingly prominent figure in Mormon history, and you'll soon see why we're working with this guy when we get into the history. Willard Richards. Willard Richards was born in Hopkinton, Massachusetts on the 24th of June, 1804. Richards suffered a childhood brain trauma and would endure tremors and partial paralysis for the rest of his life from that childhood injury. Richards would come to use his cane in his later years prior to his death in 1854 out of necessity. Willard Richards became educated at a very young age, and he began teaching school at the age of 16. At the age of 30, his sister Susan's death motivated him to go to medical school and become a physician. He became a Thomsonian botanical physician and later practiced as a general physician and midwife, but he always stayed true to the curative powers of plants and herbs. How about we call him Green Thumb Willard for a NaMo nickname? That's pretty terrible. In 1836, Willard Richards was visited by his cousins Bloody Brigham Young and Joseph Young when they gave him a Book of Mormon. Richards reportedly read the Book of Mormon twice in 10 days, and then immediately packed up his things and moved to Kirtland, where he was baptized by his cousin Brigham Young. So how about, for Willard Richards, how about Richie the Bookworm? Hey, because he reads a lot, and he's a doctor. Okay, yeah, that's terrible as well. So Willard Richards was baptized and ordained an elder rather quickly upon his arrival to Kirtland. He became a member of the traveling Quorum of 12 Apostles in 1840 while he was on a mission to Europe. He made it to England a couple of years prior to the rest of the Quorum, and that's where he met his wife, Janetta, and they had their first child in England in 1840. Willard Richards may actually mark the first Mormon missionary who met his wife on his mission, which that's something that tends to happen a lot. So why not Investigator Richards? Investigator. See what I did there? Yeah, that's a good one. All right, I'm proud of that one. Okay, all right. There's another high point that we can hit on Richards here, and we'll just discuss this briefly before we jump into the actual historical timeline for today. Richards was the primary editor of the History of the Church that was published in the Deseret News throughout 1852 in Utah. He worked in close concert with Brigham Young and Heber Kimball to scrub absolutely everything damning out of church history, and he cobbled together thousands of documents to rewrite them in Joseph Smith's first-person perspective. No other historical revisionist in all Mormon history had such a dramatic impact on how the public views the history of Mormonism than Willard Richards. Mormons today view the abstract picture of Mormon history painted by the painstaking hands of Willard Richards. How about Richard Van Gogh? Get it? 'Cause abstract art? Get it? Yeah. Okay, I know, those are terrible. Okay, Willard Richards, there's probably a lot to work with that I couldn't dig into, but maybe something was going to come up later today to give us a proper NaMo nickname for Willard Richards. What do you think we should know him as? Should we go with Green Thumb Willard, Richie the Bookworm, Investigator Richards, or Richard Van Gogh? Or maybe you have a much better name bouncing around your head for him, and I'd love to hear it. And I'd love for you to be the next week's NaMo nickname winner. Vote or propose your favorite nickname. You can tweet at Naked Mormonism with the hashtag NaMo nickname, or you can post on the Facebook page, or you send an email to nakedmormonism@gmail.com. And as I did this week, I will arbitrarily select my favorite, just like with Willie Goat Wilford, proposed by Friedrich Hayek. So, let's go ahead and dive in. Let's jump into the historical timeline by picking up with the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. The voyage from Liverpool to New York was anything but smooth. The ship Rochester finally set sail on April 21st, 1841, and we are picking up from where we last left off in Bloody Brigham's manuscript history. It is linked in the show notes should you care to read it for yourself. And these are listed by dates, so I'll be reading out the dates and saying the month when the month changes, but it starts off on April 21st. Quote, "The wind is favorable. Busily engaged nailing down and lashing our luggage to prepare for sea. The anchor weighed and sails spread at 12 meridian. We had a good breeze through the day, but nearly all the passengers were seasick and vomited at a dreadful rate. The 12 and the Saints occupied the second cabin. Other passengers occupied the steerage." Now to the 22nd of April. "Many arose quite weak through vomiting and sickness. Pleasant morning. Nearly out of sight of land. 10 sail in sight. Elders Kimball and Woodruff assisted me," there you go, Willie Goat Woodruff, "assisted me in getting the sick passengers out of their berths to take the air. Elder George A. Smith was quite sick with a severe cough." Now, I will tell you, we're jumping some of these days because Brigham Young did keep a pretty faithful journal, and each of these days, there are some days where it's just like weather as well, high winds, there's stuff that's not really relevant. I'm cutting those out. We're just hitting on some of the more important dates that are happening through this voyage. On to the 25th. Sea mountains high, headwind, ship rocking and pitching, nearly all seasick. I mean, these single line entries, he just had to sit down for 3 minutes and scratch this out, a single line. And yeah, I mean, he was at least a faithful journal keeper. That's nice. 26th, we partook of a little food this morning, but were feeble and weak. We still have headwinds and rough sea, though the sun shines. We met and prayed for the sick, and they began to amend. Now, this is one thing that we cannot stress enough when we're talking about sea voyages. These were not cruise ships that are, if you've ever been on a cruise ship, they are not so easily swayed by large waves and, seas that are mountains high, as Brigham Young puts it. But these are little dinky tugboats. I mean, they're teeny little sailboats that are kind of bobbing around on the surface of the water, and they're easily swayed by anything that's happening on the surface of the ocean. And of course, the Atlantic Ocean is known as the most treacherous to cross of the 4 oceans. So it's understandable that the people here, the majority of them were seasick, vomiting everywhere. You can't even imagine the stench of all these people not having bathed for probably weeks. They're not going to bathe at any time during this trip. Many people are vomiting in their beds. This is not a pretty picture. So Brigham Young at least does us a service of telling us that they were sick without providing any descriptive details. So thank you, Brigham. On to April 28th, he says, "Strong headwinds, which increased to a tempest. The sails were close reefed, the tempest raging furiously, sea running mountains high. We shipped heavy seas, and while in the midst of this scenery, the cry of help was heard in our cabin. We rushed to the scene and found the ropes giving way and breaking, which held about 40 tons of luggage, piled up between decks, consisting of heavy trunks, chests, and barrels, which, if once liberated from their confinement, would with one surge be hurled with great force into the berths of men, women, and children, and would have endangered the lives of all. On seeing the foundation of this mass giving way, Elder Richards, Woodruff, Pratt, and others sprang to the place of danger and braced themselves against the baggage and held it for a few moments until we partially secured it, when the captain sent several sailors with ropes, who made the same fast and secure. When this was done, I repaired to the aft quarter deck with brothers Kimball, Richards, and Woodruff and Smith, and gazed upon the grandeur of the raging tempest and the movements of the ship for a short time. We all went below, except Elders Willie Goat Woodruff and Richards, who remained until a heavy sea broke over the quarter deck, which thoroughly drenched Brother Woodruff. Brother Richards was partially saved by throwing himself under the bulwarks. We got some fancy feet Richards going on here. He dances out of the way when the tempest comes. That's great. He continues, "They then thought it best to leave and followed our example by coming below. We did not sleep that much during the night, for boxes, barrels, and tins were tumbling from one end of the cabin to the other, and in the steerage 15 berths were thrown down, 9 at one surge, all the men, women, and children thrown together in a pile. But no lives were lost, nor bones broken. Wow. Crazy day. That was a single day, April 28th. Now on to the 29th. The gale has ceased. Sea rough. Sun shines pleasantly. A fair wind for the first time since the day of sailing. We are sailing 10 knots an hour. Nearly all had a good night's rest. I was very sick and distressed in my head and stomach. On the 30th, fine breeze sailing 10 knots an hour. Fears entertained that the ship was on fire as smoke arose, but it was found to come from the cook's galley. Brother Woodruff in the morning was requested to carry the dishes to cook for washing. He got his hands full of dishes of various kinds, and as he stepped to the door of the galley, the ship gave a dreadful lurch and rocked until her studding sails reached the water. This unexpected heave plunged Brother Wilford Woodruff head foremost about 10 feet, the whole width of the galley. The cook, in trying to save him, fell on top of him. It's like, there needs to be yakety sax playing in the background of this. As this was his first introduction to the galley since he had been at sea, he begged the cook's pardon for such an abrupt entrance and withdrew, leaving the cook with 3 smashed fingers to pick up his dishes at leisure. Smashed all the dishes. Oh, I'm sorry, ran away. That's Willie Goat Woodruff. They being scattered from one end of the galley to the other. When the cook saw me, he beseeched me very earnestly. Whoever I sent to the galley, for mercy's sake, never send Mr. Willie Goat Woodruff again, as he came nigh getting killed by him. I love this. Now on to May 17th. We're jumping a pretty good chunk, half a month here. Strong headwinds. We came into view of Long Island 3 p.m. Took a pilot on board at 4 who informed us that they had not heard from the Oxford, nor any ship which left Liverpool at the time we did, nor for several days before. He also informed us that no word had been heard of the steamship President. All expected she was lost. Really fascinating. So this is something that can be touted as a miracle of God. He saw that Brigham Young and Heber Creeper Kimball and, Willie Goat Wilford and all of these saints that were immigrating, he saw to it that all of their ships made safe passage, even if a little bit unsettled, but all of the other ships were not heard of. Interesting. On the 18th, he says, strong northwest wind, sailing 9 knots an hour. We heard of the death of General Harrison, President of the United States. This is William Henry Harrison, who was elected in, January, or took office in January, basically, and then died in April. That was it. That was one of our shortest term presidents that we've ever had. And it was because of pneumonia. I believe that he was out on his inauguration day when it was raining or snowing during this terrible storm, but he was in just some kind of, presidential t-shirt or something like that, and he took ill and died very quickly after that. So this is when they finally caught word of it. May 18th, more than a month after it had happened. So on to the 19th, Brigham Young says, while passing through Sandy Hook, we ran into a fishing smack, came near sinking her with all on board. Ship navigation. Apparently they didn't have radar to watch out for other ships. We had a headwind and could not run onto the dock. Cast anchor at 11 a.m. at the quarantine ground. A steamer came down to get the latest Liverpool news. An editor who came on board paid the steamer $45 to bring him out of the ship to get the latest news. Finally, here it is. May 19th, they were able to cast anchor just outside of New York. Now on to the 20th, it says, warm, pleasant weather. We commenced early in the morning to get our luggage on deck. There was a fight between the carpenter and second mate, which ended by the first mate striking the carpenter with a junk bottle. And as he went to strike the second blow, I caught his arm and prevented him. There you go, Brigham Young, the watchdog. 2 quarantine lighters came alongside the Rochester and took all the passengers and baggage to the custom house, where we had to unload all the baggage, which was inspected by the officers, after which we reloaded on board the lighters, which took us to New York City. When we arrived at the docks, we found them covered with horses and drays and a great crowd of draymen and pickpockets, who stood ready to leap on board and devour all our baggage. And because we were unwilling to be robbed and felt disposed to do our own business without being forced to measures by draymen, They cursed and swore at a dreadful rate, and acted more like savages than civilized men. But after much difficulty, we got our goods out of the lighters and loaded on drays and had to keep constant guard over them to keep them from being stolen. Many attempts were made to steal our baggage. I collared some of the thieves and threatened to throw them overboard if they would not let it alone. I was under the necessity of striking their fingers to keep them from carrying off the trunks they laid hold of. It's chaos. Let's make America that again. Let's make it great. We were until 10 o'clock at night getting from the docks to an inn. We were all very much fatigued, for we had been constantly handling boxes, chests, barrels, and trunks from sunrise till 10 p.m. without eating or drinking. We took supper about midnight and laid down to rest at the Battery Pavilion. Finally, May 21st, Brother Kimball, Orson Pratt, and myself took lodgings at the house of Elder Adams. End quote. Finally, May 21st, 1841, the majority of the Quorum of the 12 had landed back stateside and they were continuing their journey towards the promised land of Nauvoo. The rest of April 1841 was busy as ever for the church and its leadership back at HQ in Nauvoo. They had received letters from the Quorum telling of their speedy return, which came in the midst of a bustling town of vigorous construction and excitement. Before we get into, the interim period of April and May of 1841, let's just walk it back for a second here. 1840 was a weird year for the Mormons. They had just spent a year building themselves up in Missouri over 1838, but they were kicked out after having spent less than one calendar year fabricating a lifestyle from nothing for themselves. 1839 was a year ravaged by sickness and starvation, with the Saints building makeshift lean-tos or living out of their wagons as they frequently moved around all of the land that was being purchased by Joe and the church, searching for a permanent homestead. 1840, however, was the year when the Mormons were uncertain of whether or not the state of Illinois would treat them as the state of Missouri had. Could they finally settle and put down roots in Illinois and Iowa along the Mississippi, or were the damned mobocrats going to chase them further west? If they were going to be chased out again, was it even worth going to all the work of rebuilding and planting crops if they won't be staying in Illinois? These unanswerable questions plagued the Mormons and made settling a high-risk gamble for any Mormon who was simply following the prophet. 1841, however, was different. 1841 was the first year the Mormons had any sense of permanence since being driven from Kirtland over 3 years prior. With the passing of the Nauvoo Charter, annexing of multiple territories made safe to settle for the Saints, the conversion of the Illinois state officials to Mormonism, and the blessing of dozens of politicians, it finally seemed like the Mormons would have a safe place to call home. They might have a permanent residence. Spring of 1841 marks an incredible shift in the actions of the Mormons as they would really begin to settle and build in earnest when they had been apprehensive and gun-shy of doing so prior to 1841. With the renewed zeal and confidence exhibited by the leadership during the April 1841 General Conference, the rest of the Saints were signaled that it was finally safe to call Nauvoo home. The Mormons' collective sense of well-being with this newfound feeling of permanence caused a powerful upheaval and renewed vigor for proposed projects handed down from on high. Quick little side note here. When you live in the hometown of Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and hundreds of other tech startup companies, your friends tend to be software developers. And a common theme I find in so many conversations about my friends' projects are working on is that the public face of any tech or internet company is completely different than what's really going on behind the scenes. Regardless of how shiny, beautiful, or convenient your favorite app or website is, it's incredibly likely that all of the code behind the user interface is inches away from being constantly on fire. That's how the Mormons operated. On the public face, everything looked good and pleasant, and the Mormons were the nicest people, but behind closed doors, in the actual meetings of the elites, nothing was okay, and chaos was the only ruling constant. But this trouble was only perceived by those who were dealing with it. The wider public was completely unaware of what was really going on, and even the majority of Mormons were just following the prophet with absolutely no idea how close to anarchy Nauvoo really was. While the average Mormon shared this 1841 reinvigoration with their fellow brothers in the covenant, the leadership, who knew what everything underneath the beautified streets of Nauvoo actually looked like, they were trying their level best to insulate the average Mormon while keeping things at a smooth rolling boil without exploding and being consumed. But the leadership was effective at hiding the chaos. They'd been able to create a city for the Mormons, and more importantly, the leadership had been able to foster that invaluable sense of permanence and well-being the Mormons had so desperately been lacking for the past 3 years. As this illusion of security and permanence slowly infected the saints, Joe and the elite leveraged that illusion to accomplish the necessary tasks in building up Nauvoo. First on the docket for the remainder of April 1841 was to properly organize the Nauvoo Legion. The Legion was present during the April 6, 1841 temple dedication ceremony, but that was pretty much just a bunch of dudes standing in uniformed battle lines while holding guns. Now, Joe and John Reckitt Bennett had to properly organize the Legion with legitimate military ranks. This is from the Dan Vogel, History of the Church, Source and Text Critical Edition, Volume 4, beginning on page 350. Quote, "The 1st Regiment, 1st Cohort of the Nauvoo Legion, was organized, and Captain George Miller was elected Colonel, Captain Stephen Markham, that's Piggybank Steve, Lieutenant Colonel, and Captain William Whiteman, Major of the same, consisting of 4 companies. Also, the 2nd Regiment, 2nd Cohort, was organized, and Captain Francis M. Higby was elected Colonel, Captain Nelson Higgins, Lieutenant Colonel, and Aaron H. Golden, Major, consisting of 4 companies." End quote. And just like that, with some other parts that we skipped, the Nauvoo Legion was organized into legitimate regiments with companies commanded by captains and colonels and lieutenant colonels consisting purely of trusted Mormon elites. So now this ragtag group of disorganized guys with guns could finally run drills and march in command lines with Joe and Reckitt Bennett wielding jewel-laden swords of curious workmanship at the head of the army. And they decided to run drills on July 3rd, 1841, with this letter that was dated May 4th, 1841, published in the Times and Seasons. Quote, "General orders. Pursuant to an act of the court-martial, the troops attached or belonging to the Legion will parade at the place of a general rendezvous in the city of Nauvoo for drill, review, and inspection on Saturday, the 3rd of July, at 9:30 a.m., armed and equipped according to law. At 10 o'clock, the line will be formed, and the General Company's 2nd Battalion, 1st Regiment, 2nd Cohort are directed to enroll every man residing within the bounds of their respective commands, and not attached to any other company of the Legion between the ages of 18 and 45 years, and notify them of their attachment to the service and their legal liabilities." End quote. So this notice was circulated in the Times and Seasons in mid-May edition for all of the Mormons to see. But that was a paper that Gentiles could see as well. This, along with previous sentiments, made service in the Nauvoo Legion compulsory for Mormon men between the ages of 18 and 45, and it was the responsibility of the various colonels to make sure that every able-bodied man within that age range within their jurisdiction was fulfilling their duties by enrolling in the Nauvoo Legion. But let's be clear about this. One solid criticism of the Nauvoo Legion was that it was made up solely of Nauvoo residents, which in 1841 were almost exclusively Mormons. It was also commanded by the Mormon elite, with Joseph Smith doubling as prophet of the religion and commander-in-chief of the Legion. This criticism was noticed by many, and a public declaration was required to allay concerns that the Mormons had formed a state-sanctioned religious mafia. This is from page 352 of the Vogel History of the Church, Volume 4. Quote, "The Legion is not, as has been falsely represented by its enemies, exclusively a Mormon military association, but a body of citizen soldiers organized without regard to political preferences or religious sentiments for the public defense, the general good, and the preservation of law and order, to save the innocent, unoffending citizens from the iron grasp of the oppressor, and perpetuate and sustain our free institutions against misrule, anarchy, and mob violence. No other views are entertained or tolerated. The general parades of the Legion will be in the city of Nauvoo, but all other musters will be within the bounds of the respective companies, battalions, regiments, and cohorts." End quote. So this that we just read This may have been the Nauvoo Legion policy, that they are open to all men of, without regard to political preference or religious sentiments, but that's not how it played out in practice. The Nauvoo Legion was comprised entirely of Mormon men at this time, and would remain so nearly without exception for the rest of its existence in Illinois. And another fascinating addendum to these new movements with the Nauvoo Legion was a promotion of General John C. Reckitt Bennett to Nauvoo's Master in Chancery. It's an interesting promotion, and I actually had to look up this position, Master in Chancery, because that's a government position with which I'm completely unfamiliar. Turns out that the Master of Chancery was something that was abolished in 1897 in lieu of the title of Master of Supreme Court of a given jurisdiction. So here's the definition of Master in Chancery from uslegal.com. Quote, Master in Chancery is an officer appointed by a court of equity to assist the court. Generally, Master in Chancery is a senior official or clerk of a court of chancery who assists the chancellor in various duties such as inquiring into matters referred by the court, examining cases, taking oaths and affidavits, hearing testimony, and computing damages. The office of Master in Chancery was abolished in 1897 and was replaced by the office of Master of the Supreme Court. End quote. So now we can rack up one more hat in Reckitt Bennett's professional closet. Not only was Reckitt Bennett Joe's second closest advisor at this time, only behind Hiram's sidekick Abiff Smith, but he was still the Quartermaster General of Illinois, the Mayor of Nauvoo, a General of the Nauvoo Legion, and now in May 1841, as Master in Chancery, he directs what cases the courts of Nauvoo will hear, and, more importantly, what cases that they'll refuse to grant certiorari. There was no separation of church and state in Nauvoo. The church was the government, and the same people who ran the church ran Nauvoo. They were one and the same. Bennett's appointment to this office was overseen by Judge Stephen A. Douglas. Stephen A. Douglas was friendly to the Mormons, but not a Mormon at this time. He was Secretary of State of Illinois, if I'm not mistaken. This is the same Stephen Douglas who ended up running against Abraham Lincoln for his presidency. So in 1841, his friendly stance towards the Mormons was political capital at this time, but it would serve to be his greatest political liability at a later time. People in the area surrounding Nauvoo noticed Douglas's appointment of Reckitt Bennett and scoffed at it. And they knew Reckitt Bennett as a man with sordid personal history. Most notably, Thomas Coke Sharp, writer and editor of the Warsaw Signal, a day's journey south of Nauvoo, wrote about the appointment and recent political movements of the Mormon Church. And he published this in his May 19th, 1841 publication of the Warsaw Signal. You'll find a link to this in the show notes. Quote, Headline, Appointment! We have no disposition to complain of the official acts of Judge Douglas, for whom, as a man and an officer, we maintain the highest regard. But there is one act of his which receives our unqualified disapprobation, and we speak advisedly when we say that it is frowned on with indignity by 9/10 of the substantial citizens of this county. We speak of the appointment of General Bennett to be Master in Chancery. Whether from political motives or personal regard, it is certainly an act that has astonished the members of both parties by its indiscretion. Bennett has but recently become an inhabitant of this state. He came here followed by evil reports. He joins a sect and advocates a creed in which no one believes he has any faith. His true character is not known to our citizens, nor have they any confidence in him. Under such circumstances, we believe, and we are not alone in this belief, that Judge Douglas has committed an error in countenancing and encouraging such a man by the gift of a responsible office, an office involving the rights and, in certain instances, the liberties of freemen. We, for one, say, let the citizens of this county remonstrate against the appointment. End quote. And this comes from a little bit later in the same publication under the heading of Mormons. Quote, While on the subject, however, we will notice an accusation that has been made against us, that of having, for political effect, flattered the Mormons. This is not true. So, little foundation. Thomas Coke Sharp in the Warsaw Signal, he rallied against the Mormons frequently. And he had published a previous article that discussed the political movements of the Mormon Church, and they were a little angry about it. So he is saying that, an accusation has been made that we are flattering the Mormons by covering them, but that's just not true. He goes on to say, "We have occasionally noticed their doings, but not with any such design. We believe they have the same rights as other religious bodies possess and ought to be protected in the just and proper exercise of those rights. We do not believe in persecution for opinion's sake. But whenever they, as a people, step beyond the proper sphere of a religious denomination and become a political body, as many of our citizens are beginning to apprehend will be the case, then this press stands pledged to take a stand against them. On religious questions, it is and shall remain neutral, but it is bound to oppose the concentration of political power in a religious body or in the hands of a few individuals. We say, then, that while ever the inordinate power which the prophet and the leaders of the church possess over their people is confined within its legitimate boundaries, we are content. But when it comes to be exercised or attempted beyond this, we will be ready to take as decided a stand as anyone in opposing them." We will be ready to take as decided a stand as anyone in opposing them. End quote. Joe was livid by Thomas Sharp's pointed remarks, and he published the following in the next edition of the Times and Seasons in response to what we just read out of the Warsaw Signal. From the Times and Seasons, quote, "We can hardly find language to express our surprise and disapprobation at the conduct of the editor of the Signal," the Warsaw Signal, "as manifested in that paper of the 19th instant. We had fondly hoped that the sentiments there expressed would never have dared to be uttered by any individual in the community in which we reside, whose friendship we esteem and whose virtue and honorable conduct have secured them the approval of every patriotic and benevolent mind. We are, however, anxious to know the real feelings of individuals and are glad that the latent feelings of the editor of the Signal have at last manifested themselves, clearly and distinctly. And we would ask the editor of the Signal, what is the cause of this hostility? Of this sudden and unexpected ebullition of feeling, this spirit of opposition and animosity? Whose rights have been trampled upon? Whose peace have we disturbed? General Bennett has been appointed Master in Chancery by Judge Douglas, and General Bennett is a Mormon. This is the atrocious act? This is the cause of the editor's vile vituperation? It will not require the gift of discernment to tell what spirit the editor was possessed of when he wrote the following." And then the Times and Seasons actually quotes the Warsaw Signal passage that we just read previously. Then the article goes on to say, "It is obvious that the intention is to make the community believe that General Bennett is a mere renegado, a hypocrite, and all that is base in humanity. But General Bennett's character as a gentleman, an officer, a scholar, and physician stands too high to need defending by us. Suffice it to say that he is in the confidence of the executive, holds the office of the Quartermaster General of this state, and is well known to a large number of persons of this first respectability throughout the state. He has likewise been favorably known for upwards of 8 years by some of the authorities of the Church, and has resided 3 years in this state. But being a Mormon, his virtues are construed into defects, and is thought a proper object of the base, cowardly, and ungentlemanly attack of the editor of the Signal." It goes on to say later, "The editor then, after stating that it is not his intention to interfere in our religious concerns, says," quoting the Signal, "But whenever they, as a people, step beyond the proper sphere of a religious denomination and become a political body, as many citizens are beginning to apprehend will be the case, then this press stands pledged to take a stand against them." End quote. And the Times and Seasons says in response to this quote, "Terrible annunciation! What? The editor of the Signal concentrate all his mighty energies against us? Alarming!" Now, this is where the article out of the Times and Seasons takes a little bit of a more insidious turn in petitioning the people to oppose the Signal. It goes on to say, "O ye free and independent citizens of Hancock County, whose misfortune it is to be associated with the Church of Latter-day Saints, be careful how you use your elective franchise. Do not concentrate on any one individual, particularly if opposed to the Signal, for if you do, depend upon it that an engine more terrible than that which the ancient Romans used to bring down the walls of mighty cities will be pointed at you, and play upon you with terrible destruction. Hear and take warning, for this press stands pledged to take a stand against them." Talos is coming for you. The more we reflect on the subject, the more we are satisfied of the baseness of the motives which have induced the editor to make an attack upon this community, a community which has never done him any harm, but ever treated him with hospitality and kindness. His conduct must sink him in the estimation of all those who love the prosperity of this country and state, and who are opposed of those high-toned feelings of republicanism which animated the bosoms of their ancestors, and which are the pride of Americans." End quote. I think the article speaks for itself. Joe had been a subscriber to the Warsaw Signal prior to this publication. He wasn't aware that Thomas Coke Sharp was so viciously opposed to the Mormons until this publication came out. But Joe didn't feel that it was any longer necessary to subscribe to this paper, and he sent a letter to Thomas Sharp in response to Sharp's pointed criticism. The disgust in Joseph's tone is palpable. Quote, "Nauvoo, Illinois, May 26, 1841. Mr. Sharp, editor of the Warsaw Signal. Sir, you will discontinue my paper subscription. Its contents are calculated to pollute me, and to patronize that filthy sheet, that tissue of lies, that sink of iniquity is disgraceful to any moral man. Yours with utter contempt. Signed, Joseph Smith. Postscript. Please publish the above in your contemptible paper. J.S." End quote. Sharp fired back at this by publishing the note, and then he called for Joe's lapsed subscription charges of $3. Quote, "Now, as one good turn deserves another, we annex below, for the benefit of the aforesaid prophet, a revelation from our books in this wise. Warsaw, Illinois, June 2nd, 1841. To Joseph Smith, prophet, etc., etc., etc. To 1 year's subscription to Western World, $3. Now, Western World was the name of the Warsaw Signal before it was changed in May of 1841. It went from the Western World to the Warsaw Signal. Joseph was a subscriber to the Western World. Then when it became the Warsaw Signal, that's when Thomas Sharp began editorializing things properly. So this is the way that Thomas Sharp deals with Joseph's lapsed subscription fees. "Come, Josie, fork over, and for mercy's sake, don't get a revelation that it is not to be paid. For if thou dost, we will send a prophet after thee, mightier than thou." End quote. Oh, this is just amazing. There are very few journalists that are contemporaries of Joseph Smith that match the grade A premium all-American snark of Thomas Sharp. May of 1841 can be captured quite well in this whole correspondence spanning the entire month between the Times and Seasons and Thomas Sharp's Warsaw Signal. Joe, at this time, was moving his political pawns into position. He was drawing up the blueprints for Talos. He was laying the groundwork for an empire within an empire, and he was amassing allies all along the way, while at the same time defining his enemies. Now let's just sit back and consider who it was that was sitting atop this massive empire. Joseph Smith was a criminal. He had been sued out of Kirtland for failing to pay his bills, and the majority of the church assets in Ohio had been seized by creditors or the government after the Kirtland Safety Society anti-banking company had failed. Joe had absconded with hundreds of people's money to Missouri, where he'd racked up a respectable rap sheet. Respectable or contemptible, depending on which side of this conflict you found yourself. The Mormon War in Missouri had ended with Joe and his acolytes being arrested and interred for a period of 5 months. That jail sentence ended when Joe petitioned to move the hearing to another location, and he bought off the constables who were escorting him from one location to the next with whiskey, and they let him escape. Joe was being held at that time under the charges of high treason against the United States, among other things, and he had escaped prison. He was a fugitive, awaiting status of being a felon. What are we talking about here? It's not like Illinois was on a different continent. It wasn't Illinois on Mars. He wasn't separated from all of this. Illinois was only a few hundred miles in multiple directions from people who hated Joseph Smith and wanted him arrested or dead. Joe's actions in Kirtland was a barn fire. What he did in Missouri was an entire field consumed in flames. The government had brought the blaze under control when they chased the Mormons out, but there were still pockets smoldering and the air was filled with embers. Now, in Illinois, those same trends and forces which cultivated controllable fires in Ohio and Missouri were stronger than ever, and the wind was sending drifting embers from Missouri. They were starting to land on religious kindling and smoke a little bit. People who'd been burned before couldn't help but notice that if a real fire caught enough fuel in Illinois, the Mormons would consume the whole nation. And enough embers will draw a crowd of people trying to put the flame out. But now, with this newspaper correspondence, the building up of Nauvoo, the organization of the Nauvoo Legion, the Missouri government finally had a fix on Joe. They knew where he was. They knew where he spent most of his time. They knew the people with whom he associated. They saw this little back and forth between Joe and Thomas Sharp, and they knew that he couldn't get far from Nauvoo once they decided to move. The Missouri state government had unfinished business when it came to Joe and the Mormons. The sense of security, permanence, and well-being that the Mormons had in spring of 1841 held on by a thin and very frayed thread. From the Vogel History of the Church, Volume 4, beginning on page 364. Quote, Friday, June 4th, 1841. From Joseph Smith's perspective. I called on Governor Carlin at his residence in Quincy. During my visit with the governor, I was treated with the greatest kindness and respect. It's a nice day. Joseph is visiting the governor of Illinois. Nothing was said about any requisition having come from the governor of Missouri for my arrest. In a very few hours after I had left the governor's residence, he sent Thomas King, sheriff of Adams County, Thomas Jasper, a constable of Quincy, and some others as a posse with an officer from Missouri to arrest me and deliver me up to the authorities of Missouri. Next day, Saturday, June 5th, as I was on my return from Quincy, to which place I had accompanied Presidents Hiram Smith and William Law on their mission to the east, I was arrested at the Bear Creek Hotel by 2 officers of justice on a warrant from Governor Carlin to deliver me up to the authorities of Missouri. End quote. Joseph Smith was arrested. Any feeling of permanence or well-being the Mormons felt about their settlement and livelihood was immediately shattered. Joe and the Mormons had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars and millions of man-hours to construct Nauvoo by this point. They laid the cornerstones of the temple. They formed their own militia. In their eyes, they had done everything right this time around to escape persecution from the government. But the skeletons from Joe's past in Missouri rose from the grave to ensnare him physically and destroy him spiritually. The increasingly fickle sense of permanence tacitly implied that the Mormons would be staying in Nauvoo for years. But just as that sense was starting to feel fulfilled, it was once again destroyed by perceived government persecution. Joe was a criminal. Joe was a prophet of the Lord. Whichever side of this conflict you found yourself on, the Mormons were the ones who suffered for the bad decisions of the leadership. Joseph being arrested in June of 1841 and taken into custody of a Missouri government official. How would you feel as a Mormon? It was a nightmare on repeat. Would the Mormons be chased out of Illinois now, just like they had been when Joseph was arrested in Missouri? Would Joseph even make it to Richmond, Missouri for the trial the government had waiting for him, or would he be swarmed and killed by angry mobs as soon as he stepped foot inside the state line? Or would Joe find some clever way to get out of this little sticky wicket like he had every other time in his life? In Mormonism, we're taught everything we need to pass on to our children to raise them to be productive members of the church and society at large. But what about when we leave the church? Where do we turn when we don't have a religion to raise up children in? And how do we foster a love for a life without religion and God in the minds of our progenitors? Our guest today has made an attempt at instilling a love of science and skepticism through the medium of children's science books. He's the author of the children's series book Annabelle and Aiden, and he's here with us on the line. Please welcome J.R. Beckard. J.R., welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
As well to you. Thank you for joining us. I'm really excited to talk to you about your books today. I was able to get a copy of your second book that I believe it was, and I'd like to go through it a little bit if you would like, but let's get a little bit of background on you. How did you come to write children's science book? That seems like a pretty niche kind of occupation.
Yeah, it's a kind of a long story. I don't know how much you want me to bore you with it, but I mean... I grew up in an Orthodox Jewish home. My parents decided to become religious when they got married. Very, very slowly over the next 10 years, they kind of gradually became Orthodox Jews. So I was raised in a Orthodox home, and, my dad, who I still consider him one of my best friends, and, we have a wonderful relationship, and I just love him as a person. But he was hard on me as his oldest son, to kind of mold me into, an Orthodox Jew. And I think a lot came from the fact that my parents had to prove themselves that they successfully became what they wanted to be. And I was kind of a sign of their success, I think. Okay. Whether or not I would turn out religious. But anyway, I mean, I did a lot of researching and thinking, and about 7 years ago, I started a journey probably a 1 to 2 year journey that led to atheism and secularism. And I kind of wanted to give children what I didn't have and kind of fill the God of the gaps. If people are familiar with the God of the gaps theory, I feel like theism is so largely based on the God of the gaps, more than most theists and atheists realize, I think. So I'm trying to fill that gap.
Interesting. And this is something that's not only hard to teach children about, but it's hard to understand the very concept of God of the gaps. How do you explain God of the gaps to a 5-year-old?
Right. So, I mean, Neil deGrasse Tyson described it as God is an ever-regressing pocket of scientific ignorance. So that's how I would describe it to adults. The way I would describe it to children is, I mean, I almost want to write a book called I Don't Know. I mean, the power of the words I don't know, I think they're very powerful. It's so important to be able to, how did life begin? We don't know. How do birds fly, know their way south in the winter? We don't know. How, the Big Bang, we know certain things about, but, what came before the Big Bang? In a way, we don't know. It's so important to say, I don't know. And I feel like what a lot of religion and theism does is they can't stand not knowing. They can't stand those words, I don't know. So they fill that gap, that ignorance, with unfounded beliefs, not based on evidence, that make them feel great. And, so that's what I consider God of the gaps, is just filling the gap in our knowledge with, let's face it, magic. So it's important to say, I don't know, and I don't know, but then let's find out. And that's what science is. That's what science comes in. So I'm trying to teach kids that it's okay not to know, and to have wonder, and to use the ignorance, the I don't know, as a drive to, hey, let's go find out. We could find things out. There's so much that we do know that's amazing and happens to be true. And then there's so much that we don't know. There's so much room to grow and explore. And that's what science is. So
one thing I was struck with when reading this book was how you're able to distill incredibly dense concepts and actually teach the proper verbiage and the proper scientific terms for these things, but still bake it down to a simple concept that, your target audience of, maybe 5 to 8 year olds can easily understand. And I'll to let the listeners know, the book that I read was Oh, the Things We Believed. And I love the past tense in that, believed, because that does imply that there is something that we move beyond once we learn something. But the book starts out, and the premise of it is the children Annabelle and Aiden stare up into the clouds and they see a face in the clouds. And they wonder how that came to be. And it walks you through the things that we have been significantly ignorant of and the answers that we have seen in the past before and the way that things are now. And it does even show on a little notepad on one of the pages the word pareidolia and, defines the word pareidolia. So not only is it familiarizing the children with these concepts, but it's also teaching them the proper scientific verbiage for these, incredibly complex ideas.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you saw that. It was a lot of fun to write, and I mean the one of the reasons why I thought to write it is, what's more fun than these myths? I mean, they're just fun, turtles all the way down, and
Yeah.
storks delivering babies, and UFOs and aliens, and crop circles, and pareidolia and Rorschach blots, and it's just, I had a lot of fun writing it, so I'm glad that you were able to catch those little details that I put in there. There's the face on Mars, which is actually it's a real photograph. I included the real photograph of there's a hill on Mars that, I don't know if it was in the early 1970s, it was a big deal. We thought people thought it was a face. I'm reading Carl Sagan's book, A Demon Haunted World, right now for the first time, and he's going through everything that children's book that I go through in that children's book. It's very funny.
And I have to say that it's not just in the 1970s that picture of Mars has fooled somebody. In a different life, I was fooled by it.
Okay.
So I have to ask, you have a condonement here by Lawrence Krauss and by Modern Science Mama and by the Secular Buddhist, and all of these people who have read these books and kind of, given their blessings, for lack of better words, on these books. What about opposition? Because there's no way that you're writing these concepts for children that you haven't come opposed in some way.
Right. So, the biggest opposition was that article that I think that you saw, and it was actually really funny. Anyone could put it into Google. If anyone types into Google Annabelle Aiden atheist evolution, it will come up, and it's this article that by the Christian News Network. You know what? Let me bring it up. And it's very funny because the title of it's by the Christian News Network, and the title of the article is "Increasingly Aggressive Atheists Target Children in New Evolution Promoting Book." And I'm just like, who are these group of aggressive atheists that wrote my book? Right. Because for all I know, I'm one person. I wrote it. I don't know who this group, am I going to have to split my check with somebody? I don't know who these aggressive, increasingly, I wrote it myself, so I don't know where they got that from. And, I do happen to be an atheist.
And nothing in the book struck me as particularly aggressive. I'm wondering what they're using. Is it just, did they read it before writing this article? It's just mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Yeah, I mean, when this article came out, I sold a lot more books. So when I first saw that article, I was scared. I was not used to negative press. I'm just a regular guy. I started this book series a year and a half ago. This article comes out. It's being shared by, I don't know how, by now 2,800 people. I got a little scared, but then an hour later, I was like, wow, my book is selling a lot more, and it was exciting. So that's the biggest opposition I got.
That's a little bit of persecution can be some fertilizer. The right amount of it can flourish an entire garden of intellectualism. Yes. I want to ask, what is kind of the target audience for this book, and who do you expect to kind of pick this up and say, whoa, that's really interesting, and kind of wrapped up into that? What do you hope are kind of the long-term ramifications of writing these books?
That's a very good question. I want my books to be a lot more positive and pro-science than negative or anti anything else. I'd be lying if I said that combating fundamentalist religion and ignorance and superstition was not part of this, But it's really about filling the knowledge gap and inspiring children to be critical thinkers and to be excited about our world. I think fairy tales are great. We all grew up on Humpty Dumpty. One of my favorite movies is The Never-Ending Story. I mean, fiction is wonderful. There's no doubt about it. But I feel like reality is just as exciting, and a lot of kids and adults miss out on that point. So, there's a lot of books out for children now, and I'm thinking, well, why can't there also be books out for children about reality that are just as exciting, and they just so happen to be learning at the same time? I think I thought it was a good idea, so that's really why I did it. And to answer your question, really, the books are for everyone that wants to educate their children, to arm them with facts and education and critical thinking skills that they could go out into the world with, whether they're atheists or secular homes or religious, spiritual, deist homes, pantheist homes, whatever. It's really for everybody.
I think that's a really good goal. And I mean, even as a ripe 27-year-old at the time that we're recording this, I just turned, mm-hmm. I have to say, even I enjoyed the book. The illustrations are brilliant, and really the way that illustrations are supposed to be, they properly illustrate the point. It's not like a Dr. Seuss thing where the illustrations are made and then he tries to write a storyline about it. No, the pictures thoroughly describe what we're seeing. And in addition to the rhyme that the book is written in, there are these little tiny science snippets and facts that are kind of peppered into the page in the background that are, they kind of grab your attention and draw your eyes around to different parts of the pictures that you're looking at. And it forces you to spend a bit more time lingering on each page. And I just have to say, all in all, I think it's brilliantly done. And the mission that you're on to try and educate our children with a love of science and skepticism, I think, is one of the most noble goals that anybody can take up, because the children, if we do not instill this love of science and trying to make things better in our world through provable methods, then I don't have a very positive outlook for our world. And I think that these books, no matter how much impact they have in the real world, I think that the general idea and what the mission that you're driving at is noble and is something that's worth pursuing. So all of that said, I want to thank you so much for writing these and for providing them. There will be links to everything in the show notes to the Christian News article that you and I discussed briefly, as well as to AnnabelleandAiden.com here. If you want to check the show notes, listeners, you can find them there, or you can go to what we described. And I'll just leave it to you, JR. Is there anything that you would like to plug or anywhere you'd like to send people? And also, do you have any final thoughts that you kind of want to leave us off with?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for all your kind words. It means a lot. And when I work hard on one of these books, and I really worked hard on wording, peppering the illustrations with different scientific notes, and it looks like you really noticed that. It's exciting, and I really appreciate all your kind words. And people could find the books at AnnabelleandAiden.com. That's spelled in the most common way, AnnabelleandAiden.com. And I don't really have any more final thoughts. I just want to thank you, and I love what you're doing. I got a chance to listen to a few episodes of your podcast, and I hope to continue listening, and want to thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for coming on. And I will just reiterate the point here. If you are looking for a way to properly educate children about the world of science and skepticism and a world without God, which is something that parents have to wrestle with every day, especially when they leave the church, I think that this is a really positive outlook and a proper way to do it. So once again, JR, thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
Once again, huge thanks to JR. I really enjoyed that interview, and I think he offered some useful tips and insights into hopefully instilling a love of science and skepticism into the minds of our children. Really quick couple of business items to take care of. We have, for patron listeners, this episode or this week, we are releasing the next segment of An Address to All Believers in Christ. We're really close to done with it. And for the patrons, we have our monthly NaMo Home Evening coming up this Monday. That is on February 4th, 2018. And our featured guest is going to be a Mormon historian. It's not very often that we have Mormon historians pop in for these, but it's my friend Joe Geisner, and he's going to help us put some of Nauvoo history into context and discuss something that he recently unearthed with Doctrine and Covenants section 124, which we have discussed ad nauseum at this point. So if you are a Patreon subscriber, be looking for that email. We start at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Once again, that is February 4th, coming up this upcoming Monday from when this episode releases. You'll see a link to your inbox for you to join the Hangout if you would like, or you can post questions onto the link when it is posted, and I'll try and get those questions in for Joe. And I recommend you check him out on Facebook, Joe Geisner, Geisner. He doesn't post very regularly there, but he will talk Mormon history with just about anybody if that is a topic which interests you. Next thing, I wanted to thank everybody for the birthday wishes. You guys are really awesome. Thank you. I wasn't able to reply to all of them, but for the ones that I was able to reply to and all of those that I couldn't, just thank you. It was really nice. It has been a wonderful birthday to answer all of your questions and all of your hopes. And to all of those of you who didn't, the other 2 listeners who didn't wish me a happy birthday, that's all right. It's okay. I am a human being behind this. I'm not too broken up about it. Oh well. Anyway. No, really, thank you all. It was nice of you. And on to the last item of business. We had a new patron to thank. We have Mormon Zodiac. That's exciting. A bunch of confluence of numerology and astrology. Joseph Smith would have been proud. Mormon Zodiac, thank you so much for pledging. And we also had a pledge edit by Brigham Young. Oh, God, maybe I should have gone with that for Brigham's NaMo nickname instead of Bloody Brigham. You know what? It works for both of them. Maybe I'll start using Brigham Young because it's just perfect. So thank you to both of you for your pledge and for your pledge edit and for supporting the show at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. Hope you enjoy access to the NaMo home meetings we do every month and all of the extra content, extra episodes, extra segments, debut segments of segments that we may air on the show at a later date. Just thank you so much. It's really nice of you guys. You fund the research that goes into creating this show. You allow me to sit on my couch all day and read books. Thank you for that. It's really awesome. With that, let's go ahead and shut it down for tonight. Have a few people to thank that keep everything running on the back end. First off, I want to thank Julie for running the Twitter and Facebook pages. Be sure to give her a follow at TheRealEmmaHale on Twitter. Thank you to Natalie for helping out in the logistics portion of the show. Thank you so much to Jason Camo for providing the music used in the show with his permission. You can go to aloststateofmind.com to hear more of his music there. Thanks to Andrew Torres for providing legal counsel for this show. Be sure to check out the Opening Arguments podcast to hear his wonderful takedown of so many legal topics of our day, as well as the law offices of P. Andrew Torres if you are looking for some legal consultation, especially related to podcasting. Thank you so much to all of the patrons once again for providing support for this show, and most importantly, thank you to all the phenomenally astonishing listeners out there once again for lending me your ear. Hope to talk at you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. The preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2018, all rights reserved.